They laughed at her worn-out clothes, whispered about her lack of taste, and publicly shamed her for not fitting in. Little did they know, this woman held the keys to a global fashion dynasty. Prepare to be stunned as her unassuming appearance crumbles, revealing a power so immense it will turn every head and silence every critic. You won't believe how she flips the script. Have you ever been judged by your appearance? Maybe someone looked at your shoes, your outfit, or your accessories and decided, in that split second, that they knew everything about you, that they were somehow better, superior, more refined. It happens every single day. We live in a world obsessed with surface-level signals, designer logos, Instagram-worthy outfits, the latest trends plastered across social media. We've been conditioned to believe that what you wear defines your worth, your intelligence, your right to respect. But what happens when everything you think you know is completely wrong? What happens when the person you dismiss, the one you mock, the one you look down upon, turns out to be the very person who created the standards you're trying so desperately to meet? This is the story of Sarah, a woman who walked into an ordinary day wearing what looked like ordinary clothes. A woman who became the target of ridicule, of condescending glances, of the kind of casual cruelty that people convince themselves is harmless. But here's what they didn't know. Here's what those superficial, status-obsessed mockers couldn't possibly understand. Sarah wasn't just anyone. She wasn't a victim of their judgment. She was a test, a living, breathing reminder that the world isn't always what it seems, that power doesn't always announce itself, that true luxury, real influence, and authentic style operate on an entirely different frequency than most people can comprehend. By the time you finish watching this story, you'll never look at someone the same way again. You'll question every assumption, every snap judgment, every moment you decided someone's value based on what they were wearing. Because what happened next? It didn't just humble a few rude strangers in a coffee shop. It revealed a truth about society, about fashion, about wealth and power that will completely shift your perspective. So buckle up. This isn't just a story about karma or a satisfying comeuppance. This is about the dangerous game we all play when we judge a book by its cover. And what happens when that book turns out to be a first edition worth millions? The morning light filtered through the tall windows of Luminaire Cafe, one of those upscale establishments into the heart of the fashion district where a cappuccino costs $12 and the clientele treats it like a runway. Every table was a carefully curated display of wealth signaling. Hermes Birkin bags draped over chairbacks like casual afterthoughts, Louboutin heels clicking against marble floors, wrists adorned with Cartier and Rolex timepieces that cost more than most people's cars. And then there was Sarah. She sat alone in the corner by the window, a study in comfortable simplicity. Her jacket, a soft, worn tweed in muted gray, had the kind of relaxed fit that suggested years of wear. The elbows were slightly faded, the cuffs gently frayed in a way that spoke of genuine use, not manufactured distress. Beneath it, she wore what appeared to be a simple cream-colored blouse, slightly wrinkled, tucked into high-waisted trousers that, while well-fitted, had clearly seen many seasons. Her shoes were leather flats, brown and buttery soft, molded to her feet with a kind of patina that only comes from years of faithful wear. No logos, no embellishments, no screaming declarations of brand allegiance. Her only accessories were minimal. A delicate vintage watch with a leather strap, worn thin and darkened with age, and a structured leather handbag in deep burgundy that sat beside her chair. To the untrained eye, it looked like something you might find at a second-hand shop. Beautiful in its simplicity, but unremarkable. Sarah herself exuded a quiet confidence that had nothing to do with what she was wearing. She sat with perfect posture, not the rigid, self-conscious kind that screams, "Look at me," but the natural, grounded alignment of someone completely comfortable in their own skin. Her hair was pulled back in a simple low bun, a few silver strands catching the light and blending naturally with her dark brown hair. Her face was makeup-free, showing the kind of skin that comes from good genes, good sleep, and zero anxiety about anyone else's opinion. She was reading, not scrolling through her phone like most of the cafe's patrons, but actually reading a physical book. Her focus was complete, her expression occasionally shifting with whatever she was absorbing from the pages. Every few minutes, she'd reach for her coffee cup without looking, take a measured sip, and return to her reading with the kind of contentment that suggested she had nowhere else to be and nothing to prove. To anyone with actual depth of perception, Sarah was fascinating. There was something magnetic about her self-possession, her obvious intelligence, the way she existed completely independent of the social performance happening around her. But most people don't have depth of perception. At the table near the counter sat 3 women who had turned people-watching into a competitive sport. Madison, Brittany, and Chelsea, all in their late 20s to mid-30s, each wearing what could only be described as wealth cosplay. Head-to-toe designer ensembles that screamed rather than whispered. The kind of outfits assembled from Instagram inspiration boards and personal shopper recommendations. Expensive but devoid of any personal point of view. Madison wore a Gucci logo belt so prominent it might as well have been a billboard. Brittany's Balenciaga bag, still bearing the price tag in her social media post from 3 days ago, sat on the table like a centerpiece. Chelsea's outfit was a greatest hits compilation of recognizable luxury. Chanel earrings, a Louis Vuitton scarf, Prada sunglasses perched on her head despite being indoors. They had noticed Sarah the moment she walked in 20 minutes earlier. "Oh my God," Madison had whispered, not quite quietly enough, her eyes tracking Sarah's path to her corner table. "Is she serious with that jacket?" Brittany had hidden a laugh behind her manicured hand, her lip filler preventing her mouth from closing completely as she smiled. "I literally can't. How did she even get in here? I thought this place had standards." Chelsea, always the cruelest of the 3, had simply raised her eyebrows and made a show of looking Sarah up and down with an expression of theatrical pity. "Some people just don't understand quality," she'd said, her voice dripping with condescension. "It's sad, really. She's probably here thinking she fits in." What made them so certain of their superiority? What gave them the audacity to judge another human being so thoroughly based on clothing? The same thing that's infected modern culture like a virus. The belief that visible consumption equals value. That if wealth and status aren't performed loudly enough for everyone to see, they must not exist. That the only knowledge worth having is the kind that can differentiate between this season's Prada and last season's, between a real Hermes and a convincing fake. They had learned to read price tags but had never learned to read people. So they watched Sarah with a mixture of amusement and contempt, occasionally whispering to each other, shooting glances in her direction, creating the kind of mean girl energy that successful women are supposed to outgrow, but often don't. And Sarah? She continued reading, completely unbothered, occasionally tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear, existing in a state of peace that her observers had probably never experienced. She'd been here before, not this cafe specifically, but this situation, this judgment, this dismissal. And if they'd been paying closer attention, If they'd been looking at her face instead of her clothes, they might have noticed something. The slightest smile playing at the corner of her lips. Because she knew something they didn't. The whispers continued, growing bolder with each passing minute. I wonder if she even knows where she is, Brittany mused, stirring her oat milk latte with performative delicacy. Like, did someone tell her this is the fashion district? Because clearly, she didn't get the memo. Madison leaned in conspiratorially, though her volume remained deliberately audible. Maybe she's lost or confused. Should we tell her the Salvation Army is 3 blocks over? They dissolved into laughter, the kind of tinkling, performative giggles designed to be noticed. Sarah turned a page in her book. The trio's attention shifted momentarily when a minor fashion influencer walked in. Someone with maybe 80,000 followers, enough to excite them. They waved enthusiastically, air-kissing and complimenting her obviously sponsored outfit, their voices rising in pitch and enthusiasm. But after the influencer collected her mobile order and left, their focus returned to Sarah like moths to a flame. Honestly, though, Chelsea said, her voice taking on a false tone of concern that fooled no one. Someone should really tell her, like as a kindness. This is clearly not her scene, and she's probably so embarrassed, but doesn't know it yet. The jacket alone. Madison shook her head slowly, eyes wide with manufactured sympathy. I mean, my mother donated something similar to charity in like 2005, and it wasn't even nice then. Brittany pulled out her phone, angling it carefully. For a horrifying moment, it seemed like she might try to photograph Sarah. This is honestly content, she whispered. Like, what not to wear realness? Don't, Chelsea said, though her tone suggested she was tempted. But seriously, those shoes. I wore almost identical ones in middle school. From Payless, before it went bankrupt. Which should tell you everything. A few other cafe patrons had started to notice the commentary. Some looked uncomfortable, shooting sympathetic glances towards Sarah. Others, infected by the same superficial value system, smirked and whispered to their companions. A couple of people looked like they wanted to say something in Sarah's defense, but lacked the courage to confront the mean girl energy emanating from the trio's table. The barista, a young woman with pink hair and multiple piercings, caught Sarah's eye while wiping down the counter. There was a question in her expression. Are you okay? Should I say something? Sarah gave her the subtlest headshake and a small, reassuring smile. I'm fine. This doesn't touch me. Because it didn't. Sarah had been underestimated her entire life. Deliberately so for the past decade. She'd been dismissed in boardrooms by men who assumed she was an assistant. She'd been patronized at industry events by people who didn't recognize her name. She'd been seated in the back rows of fashion shows she'd essentially funded. She'd watched people trip over themselves trying to impress her when they finally realized who she was. And she'd watched those same people treat servers, drivers, and assistants with casual contempt. She'd learned long ago that how people treat those they perceive as beneath them reveals everything about their character. And these three, they were revealing volumes. I just don't understand how someone leaves the house like that, Madison continued, genuinely perplexed, as if Sarah's clothing choices represented a mathematical equation that didn't compute. Like, doesn't she have friends, a mirror, basic self-awareness? Maybe she thinks it's vintage, Brittany offered, making air quotes around the word vintage as if it were a ridiculous concept. You know how some people try to do that whole I don't care about fashion thing. But there's a difference between vintage and Value Village, sweetie. Chelsea took a long, deliberate sip of her matcha latte, her eyes never leaving Sarah. I bet she saw someone actually cool wearing secondhand and thought she could pull it off. But here's the thing about that aesthetic. You have to have the bone structure and the confidence to make it work. You can't just look poor and think it's a vibe. The cruelty was casual, almost bored, which made it worse somehow. They weren't even passionate in their judgment. This was simply how they interacted with the world. A constant stream of assessment and dismissal, elevating themselves by diminishing others. Sarah checked her vintage watch, a gesture so natural she didn't even think about it. The trio noticed. Even her watch. Madison stage whispered, leaning so far over the table she nearly knocked over her coffee. Is that a Timex? Oh, honey, no. Not here. Not in this room. They had no idea, none whatsoever, that the Timex on Sarah's wrist was actually a 1940s Patek Philippe Calatrava that had belonged to her grandmother, worth approximately $80,000, or that its value was irrelevant to Sarah, who wore it because it connected her to a woman she'd loved deeply, not because of its price tag. They couldn't conceive of a world where something precious might look modest, where true luxury didn't need to announce itself, where confidence was so complete, so unshakable, that external validation became utterly irrelevant. Sarah turned another page, her expression serene. And the storm continued to build. The shift from subtle mockery to direct confrontation happened suddenly, the way these things often do. Chelsea stood up, smoothing her designer dress with deliberate precision. You know what? I'm going to say something. Someone needs to. It's actually cruel to let her sit here completely clueless. Chels, don't, Brittany said, but her tone was excited rather than cautionary. This was entertainment, Madison grinned. This is going to be iconic. Chelsea picked up her phone and her Balenciaga bag, strutting towards Sarah's table with the kind of exaggerated confidence that comes from an audience and a misplaced sense of superiority. The cafe seemed to hold its breath. Sarah, still reading, didn't look up until Chelsea's shadow fell across her table. "Excuse me," Chelsea said, her tone dripping with false sweetness. "Hi. Sorry to interrupt, but I felt like I had to say something," as one woman to another. Sarah looked up slowly, marking her place in the book with one finger. Her expression was polite, curious, completely neutral. "Yes?" Up close, Chelsea faltered for just a second. There was something in Sarah's eyes. A depth, an intelligence, a complete lack of the embarrassment or insecurity Chelsea had expected to find. But she'd committed to this performance, and her friends were watching. "I just wanted to let you know," Chelsea continued, her voice loud enough for nearby tables to hear, "that this cafe is well, it's a fashion industry spot. Like, very industry. And I noticed you seem maybe a little unaware of the vibe here. And I thought, as a kindness, I should mention that you might be more comfortable somewhere else. Somewhere more casual." The audacity was breathtaking. Several patrons gasped audibly. The pink-haired barista stopped mid-pour, mouth open. Even Madison and Brittany looked momentarily shocked at how far Chelsea had taken it. Sarah set her book down gently on the table. She folded her hands, gave Chelsea her complete attention, and smiled. Not a mocking smile, not an angry smile. A genuinely amused smile, like someone had just told her an unexpectedly funny joke. "That's very thoughtful of you," Sarah said, her voice warm, cultured, with the kind of refined accent that comes from excellent education and international upbringing. "You're concerned about my comfort. That's sweet. Chelsea blinked, thrown off by the response. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. I mean, yeah, just, you know. Sometimes people don't realize when they're out of place and... Out of place, Sarah repeated softly, as if testing the words. Interesting phrase. At that moment, Sarah's phone buzzed on the table. The screen lit up, and before Sarah could turn it over, Chelsea's eyes caught the caller ID. Atelier Mainline. Sarah picked up the phone with unhurried grace. Excuse me for just one moment, she said to Chelsea, who stood frozen, suddenly unsure whether to stay or retreat. Bonjour, Margot, Sarah said into the phone, switching effortlessly into flawless French. Oui, j'ai reçu les échantillons. The fabric quality is exquisite. Exactly what we discussed for the Heritage Collection. Non, use the original 62 pattern, not the modified version. Perfect. Also, confirm my meeting with Vogue's editor tomorrow at 3. Merci. À bientôt. She ended the call and returned her attention to Chelsea, whose face had begun an interesting journey from smug superiority to confused uncertainty. I'm so sorry, Sarah said pleasantly. You were saying? Something about me being out of place? Chelsea's mouth opened and closed. I didn't mean... I was just... The cafe had gone completely silent. Everyone was watching now. The energy in the room shifted entirely. Sarah reached into her burgundy leather bag, that unremarkable bag that was actually a vintage Hermes plume from their 1970s collection, discontinued and extremely rare, and withdrew a slim card case. It too looked simple, unadorned, just buttery soft leather. She extracted a single business card and held it out to Chelsea with a kind of grace that suggested she was offering a gift. Here, Sarah said gently, in case you ever need to contact me, or perhaps you'd like to better understand what the industry actually looks like. Chelsea took the card automatically, her hand trembling slightly. The card was minimalist perfection. Cream-colored, heavy stock, subtle embossing. No flashy colors, no excessive design. Just elegant typography that read, Sarah Laurent, Creative Director, Legacy Chairman Maison Laurent Est, 1898. Below it, a Paris address in the 8th arrondissement, a New York address on 5th Avenue, and a London address in Mayfair. Chelsea stared at the card. Her face drained of color. You're, she whispered, the person whose family created the vibe you're so concerned about protecting. Sarah finished for her, her tone still kind but now carrying an unmistakable edge of authority. The jacket you called outdated? It's a 1967 original from my grandmother's first ready-to-wear collection. This Timex is a Patek Philippe from 1943. These Payless shoes are bespoke Laurents from our private atelier. We don't make them for public sale. The cafe had become a tableau. No one moved, no one breathed. Sarah stood, gathering her book and bag with leisurely confidence. She was taller than Chelsea, and her posture made her seem even more so. Not threatening, just commanding, present, undeniable. Here's something I've learned in this industry, Sarah said, her voice clear enough for the entire cafe to hear. Real luxury doesn't scream. Real style doesn't require validation. And real confidence doesn't need to diminish others to feel substantial. She looked directly at Chelsea, then at the frozen Madison and Brittany still sitting at their table, mouths agape. The saddest thing about people obsessed with appearances, Sarah continued, is that they never look deep enough to see anything real. They collect logos like trophies, but understand nothing about craft, heritage, or actual beauty. They perform wealth, but possess no richness of character. She paused, letting it sink in. This cafe. My family has owned the building since 1992. You're welcome to stay, of course. But perhaps use the time to reflect on who you're actually talking to before you make assumptions based on whether someone's clothes scream loud enough for you to hear. With that, Sarah walked toward the exit, her worn leather flats moving silently across the marble floor. The entire cafe watched her go. And Chelsea stood there, still holding the business card, her face a mask of absolute horror. Sarah didn't storm out. She didn't slam doors or make dramatic exits. That would have been beneath her, and more importantly, it would have suggested she was emotionally affected by people whose opinions held no weight in her world. Instead, she paused at the counter where the pink-haired barista stood, still frozen in disbelief at what had just unfolded. "Thank you for the coffee, Marina," Sarah said warmly, reading the name tag and offering a genuine smile. "It was perfect, as always. The new blend you recommended last week? We're actually considering something similar for our Milan flagship's cafe." Marina's eyes widened. You remember me?" "Of course," Sarah said simply. "You're excellent at what you do, and you recommended a product with genuine knowledge rather than just upselling. That's rare and valuable." She placed a $50 bill on the counter for a $12 coffee. "The rest is for you. Talent should always be recognized." It was a master class in grace. In 20 seconds, Sarah had demonstrated more genuine human connection than the trio of mockers had probably shown anyone in months. She turned back toward the cafe, not to gloat, but to deliver one final observation. The three women were still paralyzed in various states of shock. Chelsea remained standing by Sarah's now empty table, the business card clutched in her trembling hand. Madison had pulled out her phone and was clearly Googling, her face growing paler with each scroll. Brittany looked like she might cry or vomit or both. "You know what the most expensive thing in fashion is?" Sarah asked, her voice carrying easily through the silent room. Not loud, not aggressive, just clear and authoritative. "It's not a Birkin bag or a couture gown. It's not a piece of jewelry or a limited edition collaboration." She let the question hang in the air. "It's legacy. It's a reputation built over generations. It's the kind of credibility that can't be bought, only earned through decades of consistent excellence, innovation, and integrity." Sarah's gaze swept across the three women, and there was no anger in her eyes. Almost disappointingly for them, there wasn't even satisfaction, just a calm, almost professorial assessment. "My great-grandmother started Maison Laurent in 1898 with nothing but skill, vision, and an absolute refusal to compromise on quality," Sarah continued. "She dressed everyone from European aristocracy to American cinema icons, not because she chased trends or begged for attention, but because her work spoke for itself." Madison had found what she was looking for on her phone. Her face was now completely white. She showed the screen to Brittany, whose perfectly made-up eyes went wide with recognition and horror. There it was, Sarah Laurent, photographed at the Met Gala, at Paris Fashion Week, at charity galas and industry events. There she was in Vogue, in WD, in the business of fashion. Articles about her revolutionary sustainable practices, her multi-billion-dollar empire, her family's indelible mark on fashion history. And in almost every photo, she wore the same understated elegance she'd worn in the cafe. Vintage pieces, simple cuts, nothing flashy. Because when you have nothing to prove, you prove nothing. "My grandmother taught me that clothes should serve you, not the other way around," Sarah said. "You shouldn't dress to impress strangers. You shouldn't perform wealth for an audience. You should wear things that make you feel authentic, comfortable, and aligned with your values. She gestured to her worn tweed jacket. This jacket? My grandmother wore it when she opened our New York boutique in 1967. It's been featured in museums. Fashion historians have asked to archive it. But I wear it because when I do, I feel connected to her strength, her vision, her refusal to let anyone else define her worth. Chelsea finally found her voice, though it came out as a whisper. Miss Laurent, I am so incredibly sorry. I didn't know. I never meant to. You didn't know my name, Sarah interrupted gently. But you knew I was a person. You knew I could hear you. You knew your words were designed to hurt, to diminish, to shame. My identity doesn't change the cruelty of that choice. The truth of it landed like a physical weight. If I had been exactly who you assumed I was, someone with less money, less status, less fashion sense by your definition, would that have made your mockery acceptable? Sarah asked. Would it have been kind? Would it have been right? Silence. The problem isn't that you misjudged my bank account, Sarah continued. It's that you use bank accounts as a measure of human value, that you've confused price tags with worth, that you've mistaken performance for substance. She moved toward the door, then paused one final time. I'm going to give you all some advice, free of charge, which is ironic given what my consulting rate usually is, Sarah said. And now there was the faintest hint of dry humor in her voice. If you want to be taken seriously in this industry, in any industry, develop a point of view. Cultivate actual knowledge. Learn the difference between fashion and costume, between style and uniform, between confidence and insecurity dressed up in logos. She reached for the door handle. And maybe, just maybe, try treating people with basic human decency regardless of what they're wearing. You'll find it makes you infinitely more stylish than any designer label ever could. With that, Sarah Laurent, heiress to a fashion empire, keeper of a legacy that had shaped global style for over a century, and a woman of more class and grace than her mockers could aspire to in a lifetime, walked out into the morning sunlight. The door closed softly behind her. And inside the cafe, 3 women sat in the ruins of their own making, understanding for the first time the difference between looking expensive and being valuable. For a long moment after Sarah's departure, nobody in the cafe moved. It was as if someone had pressed pause on reality, freezing everyone in place while they processed what had just happened. Then, all at once, the spell broke. Chelsea stumbled back to the table, her legs barely supporting her. She collapsed into her chair, the business card still gripped so tightly in her hand that it was beginning to crease. Her face had gone from pale to blotchy, red creeping up her neck in a physical manifestation of her humiliation. "Oh my God," she breathed. "Oh my God, that was Sarah Laurent. Sarah Laurent." Madison's hands were shaking as she continued scrolling through her phone. "She's worth... It says here the company valuation is over $3 billion. $3 billion. Her family literally invented half the silhouettes we wear. They've dressed every major celebrity, every royal family, every..." Her voice trailed off as the magnitude of their mistake became increasingly clear. Brittany had gone eerily quiet, her usual bubbly persona completely deflated. She was staring at nothing, clearly running through every horrible thing they'd said in the past half hour, each memory hitting like a fresh wave of mortification. "I took a picture," she whispered suddenly. "Earlier, I took a picture and sent it to the group chat. I captioned it "Fashion Emergency" with a skull emoji. "Delete it," Chelsea hissed urgently. "Delete it right now." I sent it to 40 people. "Then message them. Tell them to delete it." Oh God, if that gets out, if anyone knows we... Around them, other cafe patrons had begun whispering. And these whispers were no longer conspiratorial or amused. They were judgmental, disapproving. The social current had completely reversed, and now the trio found themselves on the receiving end of the contempt they'd been so carelessly distributing. A woman at a nearby table leaned over to her companion, not bothering to lower her voice. "Can you imagine being that embarrassing? Mocking Sarah Laurent? I would literally never show my face in this district again." "I heard every word they said," another patron added, equally audible. "Going on and on about her clothes. Meanwhile, she probably has more fashion knowledge in her little finger than they'll acquire in their entire lives." Madison pulled up Instagram, her fingers flying across her screen. "She has 2.8 million followers. There are entire fan accounts dedicated to her. Look, Sarah Laurent spotted at Paris Fashion Week, wearing vintage Maison Laurent, teaching us all a masterclass in quiet luxury." She scrolled further. "Sarah Laurent proves old money doesn't need to scream. The heiress who rejected fast fashion and championed sustainability decades before it was trendy. How Sarah Laurent single-handedly preserved her family's legacy while revolutionizing it for modern consumers." Each headline was another knife to their collective ego. Chelsea's phone buzzed. Then again, and again. The group chat was exploding. "OMG, you guys, do you know who that is? Please tell me you didn't actually say that to Sarah Laurent. I'm dying of secondhand embarrassment. Delete my number. I don't know you." One message came from an acquaintance who worked at a fashion PR firm. "Just heard what happened at Luminaire. You three are being talked about all over the industry. This is bad. Call me." Chelsea felt her carefully constructed social standing crumbling in real time. In their world, reputation was currency, and they'd just declared bankruptcy in the most public way possible. "We have to apologize," Brittany said desperately. "Like a real apology. Maybe flowers, or... I don't know. What do you send someone who owns a fashion empire?" "Nothing we can afford would matter to her," Madison said bitterly, the truth of their insignificance finally hitting home. Marina, the barista, approached their table with a careful expression. "Excuse me, but I'm going to need to ask you to leave." Chelsea's head snapped up. "What?" "Miss Laurent is a valued regular customer who treats our staff with respect and kindness," Marina said firmly, her earlier timidity replaced by quiet conviction. "You three created a hostile environment and harassed a patron. The manager has asked me to inform you that you're no longer welcome here." The final humiliation. They gathered their designer bags, their logo-covered accessories, all the expensive armor that had failed to protect them from their own cruelty, and walked out of Luminaire Cafe with their heads down and their egos shattered. Outside, the fashion district bustled with life, completely indifferent to their disgrace. And somewhere in that crowd, Sarah Laurent continued her day, unbothered and unchanged, because she'd never needed their approval in the first place. To understand the true weight of what just happened, we need to go back to where it all began, to the foundation of a legacy that three superficial strangers had unwittingly mocked. Picture Paris, 1898, the Belle Époque, the City of Lights at the height of its artistic and cultural revolution. In a modest atelier on the Rue de la Paix, a young seamstress named Céline Laurent bent over her work by candlelight, her fingers moving with practiced precision across fabric that seemed to come alive under her touch. She was 24 years old, unmarried, scandalous for the time, and possessed of a vision that would change fashion forever. Celine didn't come from money. Her father was a tailor, her mother a laundress. But what she lacked in pedigree, she possessed in raw talent and unshakable conviction. While other designers of the era prioritized ornament and restriction, the suffocating corsets, the impossible silhouettes, Celine believed in something revolutionary. That women's clothing should allow women to actually move, breathe, and live. Her first collection was dismissed by established fashion houses as too simple, too radical, too comfortable. Women's fashion was meant to display wealth and status, not prioritize function. Who was this working-class girl to challenge centuries of tradition? But Celine persisted. And in 1899, something extraordinary happened. An American heiress visiting Paris, a woman tired of fainting from tight-laced corsets and clothes that treated her body as a mannequin rather than a human being, wandered into Celine's small atelier. She left with 3 pieces: a walking suit that allowed her to stride freely, a tea gown that didn't require assistance to put on, and an evening dress that was elegant without being torturous. When she wore that evening dress to a dinner party hosted by the Vanderbilts, every woman in attendance demanded to know who had created it. Within a year, Maison Laurent had moved to a larger location. Within 5 years, Celine was dressing European aristocracy. Within 10, she had boutiques in Paris, London, and New York. But she never forgot where she came from. Never started believing that price tags determined human worth. Never confused luxury with ostentation. The archive footage and photographs tell the story better than words ever could. There's Celine in 1910. Dignified and unsmiling in the way people were in old photographs, standing in front of her Paris flagship. She's not wearing jewels or elaborate decoration, just a beautifully cut jacket and a simple, high-necked blouse. Quality over quantity, substance over show. Then there's her daughter, Marguerite, in the 1930s, who took the house through the Depression by refusing to sacrifice quality despite economic pressure. While other fashion houses collapsed or compromised, Marguerite famously said, "We will make fewer pieces before we make inferior ones." She's photographed in her design studio, wearing a work apron over what appears to be a simple day dress, surrounded by fabrics and sketches. Nothing about her appearance screamed wealth, yet she was building an empire. The 1950s and 60s brought Genevieve, Sarah's grandmother, the woman who wore the tweed jacket Sarah had on in the cafe. Genevieve expanded Maison Laurent to international prominence, dressing everyone from Grace Kelly to Audrey Hepburn. But in her personal life, she was famously low-key. There's a candid photograph of her at a cafe, perhaps the very cafe now housed in her family's building, wearing simple clothes, reading a newspaper, indistinguishable from any other Parisian woman. My grandmère used to say that if you need your clothes to tell people who you are, you haven't figured out who you are yet, Sarah had told an interviewer for a Vogue profile 3 years ago. The article sits in the Maison Laurent archives, a masterclass in quiet confidence. The photographs show what the trio at the cafe couldn't see. That for 4 generations, Laurent women had dressed with understated elegance. That they'd chosen vintage pieces over new ones, not out of necessity, but philosophy. That they'd pioneered quiet luxury decades before it became a trend. There's Sarah's mother, Isabel, in the 1990s, revolutionizing sustainable fashion before it was fashionable. She's photographed wearing a jacket from the 1960s Laurent collection, paired with modern trousers, demonstrating that true style is timeless. She was worth hundreds of millions, but you'd never know it from her appearance. And then there's Sarah herself, growing up surrounded by this legacy but never crushed by its weight. Photographs from her childhood show a girl in simple, well-made clothes, playing in the gardens of the family's Parisian estate. Teenage Sarah at fashion shows, sitting in the second row, never the first, because the first row was for clients and press, watching with keen, intelligent eyes. University-aged Sarah at Cambridge, studying business and art history, wearing vintage Laurent pieces mixed with student budget basics. But here's what the photographs don't show: the deliberate choice Sarah made in her late 20s. She'd just taken over as creative director, the youngest person ever to lead Maison Laurent. The pressure was immense. Could she maintain a legacy built over a century? Would she modernize or preserve? How could she prove herself to an industry that judged women twice as harshly as men? Instead of trying to outflash her competitors, instead of making a loud entrance to demand attention, Sarah did something unexpected. She stripped everything back. She started wearing pieces from the Maison Laurent archives. Her grandmother's jackets, her great-grandmother's blouses, her mother's trousers. She had them carefully preserved and altered when necessary, but she wore them. Truly wore them, not as museum pieces, but as living garments. These clothes have stories, she explained in an interview with Business of Fashion. They represent moments of innovation, of courage, of women who refuse to be limited by society's expectations. When I wear my grandma's jacket, I'm not just wearing fabric and thread. I'm carrying forward a philosophy that real elegance is internal, that quality outlasts trends, and that you should never, ever let anyone else define your value. The article included a breakdown of what she'd worn to that year's Met Gala. A new gown that was actually a 1962 Maison Laurent piece, carefully restored, that had originally been worn by a famous actress. The fashion world went crazy for it. Suddenly, everyone wanted vintage Laurent. The archive pieces became more coveted than the new collections. Sarah had turned her family's history into its future. She'd proven that sustainability could be luxurious, that old could be more relevant than new, that a 126-year-old fashion house could lead rather than follow. And she'd done it all, while being constantly underestimated by people who mistook her worn jacket and simple accessories for ignorance rather than intention. The mockers in the cafe had looked at Sarah and seen someone who didn't understand fashion. The devastating irony? They were criticizing a woman whose family had literally written the rules they were so desperately trying to follow. They were fashion students mocking the professor. They were amateurs critiquing the master. They were people who'd learned to read price tags, judging someone who understood the actual language of style. But Sarah's path to that moment in the cafe, to that perfect, unshakable confidence, hadn't been as smooth as it might have appeared. Yes, she was born into extraordinary privilege. Yes, she grew up surrounded by beauty, luxury, and opportunity. But she'd also grown up with enormous pressure, constant scrutiny, and the weight of a legacy that could crush someone who wasn't strong enough to carry it. Her childhood was split between Paris, New York, and London, following her mother's work. She attended elite schools where everyone knew her family name, where teachers treated her differently, some with reverence, others with skepticism, as if she needed to constantly prove she'd earned her place rather than bought it. I was either the Laurent girl or the rich kid, Sarah had confided to a close friend years ago. Never just Sarah. People made assumptions constantly. Either I was a spoiled heiress who'd amount to nothing, or I was obligated to be perfect because of my name. There was no in-between, no space to just be human. The real turning point came when she was 16. She'd accompanied her grandmother Genevieve to a charity gala. One of those glittering affairs where old money met new money, and everyone performed their wealth like a competitive sport. Sarah had worn a beautiful dress, had her hair professionally styled, had looked every inch the privileged heiress. At her table was a woman, probably in her 60s, dripping in jewelry and designer labels. When she discovered who Sarah was, her entire demeanor changed. "Oh, a Laurent," she'd gushed. "How wonderful! You know, I've been trying to get an appointment at your Paris atelier for months. Perhaps you could help me? Just a word to the right person?" Sarah, young and not yet skilled in navigating these situations, had politely explained that she didn't work for the company yet, that she was still in school. The woman's face had changed instantly. The warmth vanished, replaced by cool dismissal. "Oh, well then I suppose you're not actually useful yet, are you?" She'd turned away, literally turning her back on Sarah, and spent the rest of the dinner courting someone she perceived as more valuable. The casual cruelty of it, the transparent transactionality, had stung. But more than that, it had taught Sarah a crucial lesson. Many people didn't see her as a person. They saw her as a resource, a connection, a means to an end. That night, she'd found her grandmother on the terrace, escaping the party for a moment of quiet. "Grand-mère," Sarah had asked, "how do you know who's real? How do you know who actually cares about you versus who just wants something from you?" Genevieve had been quiet for a long moment, looking out over the city lights. "You test them, ma chérie," she'd finally said. "Not intentionally, not cruelly, but you see how people treat you when they think you have nothing to offer, when they don't know your name, when you can't benefit them. How do you do that when everyone knows who you are?" Genevieve had smiled, a mischievous glint in her eye. "You'd be surprised how invisible you can become when you're not wearing labels and logos. When you dress simply, when you don't announce yourself, most people only see what they expect to see." That conversation planted a seed. When Sarah went to university, she chose Cambridge, studying business and art history. She made a deliberate decision. She used her mother's maiden name, Rousseau, on all her registration materials. She told people her family was in textiles when asked, which was technically true. She wore simple, inexpensive clothes, mixed with vintage pieces from her family's archive that no one recognized, because they predated Instagram and logomania. For 3 years, she lived as a relatively normal student, and she learned everything. She learned who befriended her for her personality, her ideas, her humor, not her connections. She learned how people treated service workers, classmates they didn't find useful, professors they didn't need to impress. She learned who had character and who had performance. She also experienced judgment for the first time from the other side. There was a group of wealthy students, not unlike the trio from the cafe, who decided Sarah, or Sophie Rousseau as they knew her, wasn't worth their time. She didn't carry the right bags, didn't wear the right brands, didn't summer in the right places. She overheard them once, laughing about her charity shop aesthetic, and wondering how she'd even gotten into Cambridge. Probably a scholarship student, one had sniffed. Good for her for trying, I suppose. The old Sarah, the 16-year-old who'd been hurt by the woman at the gala, might have been wounded, but University Sarah had just smiled to herself and gone back to her reading. Because she'd discovered something liberating. When you know your worth, when you're genuinely secure in your identity and value, other people's opinions become background noise. Irritating sometimes, yes, but ultimately powerless. After graduation, she worked her way through Maison Laurent from the ground up, her mother's insistence. She spent 6 months working retail in their London boutique, using her real name this time, but with no special treatment. She dealt with difficult customers, stood for 8-hour shifts, learned what it meant to be on the receiving end of the fashion industry's often brutal customer service experiences. She worked in their manufacturing facilities, understanding production. She spent time in the archives, cataloging and restoring historical pieces. She did a stint in marketing, in finance, in sustainability development. By the time she took over as creative director at 32, she'd done virtually every job in the company. She understood fashion not just from the privileged designer's perspective, but from every angle, including what it felt like to be judged, dismissed, and underestimated. "My mother once told me that privilege is a magnifying glass," Sarah had said in an interview. "It makes your successes look bigger, but it also magnifies your failures and your challenges. The question is, what do you do with it? Do you hide behind it, or do you use it to see more clearly?" Sarah had chosen to see clearly. She'd chosen to remember what it felt like to be invisible, dismissed, judged. She'd chosen to wear her grandmother's jacket, not in spite of people's judgment, but because their judgment was irrelevant. She'd built her confidence on something more solid than designer labels or social approval. On competence, on legacy, on knowing exactly who she was and what she stood for. So when 3 strangers in a cafe mocked her clothes, laughed at her appearance, and tried to make her feel small, they weren't encountering a victim. They were encountering a woman who'd already walked through that fire and emerged as steel. The aftermath of the Luminaire Cafe incident rippled outward in ways the trio couldn't have imagined. Within hours, the story had spread through the fashion district like wildfire. Not through official channels or press releases. Sarah would never have dignified the incident with public acknowledgement, but through the organic, unstoppable network of industry gossip. The other patrons who'd witnessed it told their friends. Those friends told their colleagues. Marina, the barista, mentioned it to a regular who happened to work at a fashion blog. By evening, blind items were appearing on industry gossip sites. Which 3 fashion wannabes just publicly humiliated themselves by mocking a legendary heiress at her own family's cafe? Spoiler, she was wearing vintage pieces worth more than their entire wardrobes combined. The second-hand embarrassment is real. Chelsea, Madison, and Brittany watched their social currency plummet in real time. Invitations to events suddenly dried up. PR packages from brands stopped arriving. DMs from people wanting to collaborate went silent. In their world, where relevance was measured in tags, likes, and access, they'd become toxic. Chelsea attempted damage control, posting a carefully crafted apology on her Instagram stories. "I want to sincerely apologize for my behavior today. I was judgmental and superficial, and I deeply regret any hurt I caused. Today I learned a valuable lesson about looking beyond appearances." #growth, #learning, #humbled. The comments were merciless. "Girl, you didn't learn anything. You're just embarrassed you got caught." The fact that you only apologized after finding out who she was says everything. Would you have apologized if she wasn't rich and famous? Exactly. She deleted the post within 2 hours. Madison went into full retreat, making her accounts private and declining all social engagements. The humiliation was too much, too public. She'd built her entire persona on being someone who knew fashion, who had taste and discernment. Having that facade shattered so publicly was more than her ego could handle. Brittany, surprisingly, had the most authentic reaction. She sent a handwritten letter to Maison Laurent's headquarters, addressed to Sarah personally. Not an email, not a DM, but actual stationery and a stamp. In it she wrote, "Miss Laurent, I don't expect you to forgive me, and I'm not writing to ask you to. I'm writing because you deserve better than how I behaved. You deserve basic human kindness, which I failed to give you. You were right. It wouldn't have mattered if you were a billionaire or a student or anyone else. Cruelty is cruelty. I'm truly sorry, and I'm going to work on being better. Thank you for the lesson, even though I didn't deserve your grace. Brittany." She never received a response, and she didn't expect one. But 2 weeks later, she found herself unexpectedly accepted into a competitive workshop on sustainable fashion practices. A workshop run by Maison Laurent's Education Foundation. Was it connected? She'd never know for sure. But she showed up, worked hard, and kept her mouth shut about who she knew or where she'd been. Small changes, but changes nonetheless. As for the cafe incident itself, it became a cautionary tale in fashion circles, a story told at industry events and dinner parties. Have you heard about the women who mocked Sarah Laurent? Can you even imagine? It became a parable about assumptions, about the danger of judging books by their covers, about the difference between expensive and valuable. And Sarah? She never spoke about it publicly, never mentioned it in interviews or used it as an example, because she didn't need to. She simply continued being exactly who she'd always been. A woman who knew her worth had nothing to do with whether others recognized it. She continued wearing her grandmother's jacket, her vintage watch, her simple leather flats. And she continued building a legacy that had outlasted a century and would outlast her critics by 1,000 more. So what can we learn from Sarah's story? What's the deeper message beneath this satisfying tale of judgment and reversal? First, and most obviously, never judge people by their appearance. It's not just because you might embarrass yourself when you discover they're secretly powerful or wealthy. It's because every person you encounter carries a story you don't know, experiences you haven't lived, and value that exists independently of your assessment. Sarah was worth billions, yes. But she would have been exactly as worthy of respect if she'd been a student, a retiree, or someone genuinely wearing thrift store clothes out of necessity rather than choice. Her humanity didn't come from her bank account. The cruelty directed at her would have been just as wrong, regardless of her last name. Second, true confidence is quiet. The trio at the cafe performed wealth and status because they were insecure. Their designer labels were armor, their mockery of others a way to feel superior. Meanwhile, Sarah sat in her vintage jacket, completely unbothered, because she had nothing to prove to anyone. When you really know who you are, when your sense of self is built on something solid like competence, values, and genuine relationships, you don't need external validation. You don't need logos to announce your worth. You don't need to diminish others to feel substantial. Third, quality outlasts trends. Sarah's jacket was over 50 years old and still beautiful, still functional, still stylish. How many of the trio's trendy pieces will they still wear in 5 years? In 10. Fast fashion creates a cycle of constant consumption and disposal, while true quality, true style, is timeless. This applies beyond clothing. Quality relationships outlast transactional ones. Quality work outlasts flashy projects with no substance, Quality character outlasts performed personality. Fourth, how you treat people when you think they can't benefit you reveals everything about your character. Sarah mentioned this explicitly. The problem wasn't that the trio misjudged her status. It was that they used perceived status as justification for cruelty. Pay attention to how people treat servers, retail workers, janitors, interns, anyone they perceive as beneath them. That's who they really are. And conversely, examine your own behavior. Are you kind only to people who can advance your interests? Or are you kind because kindness is a value you hold regardless of circumstance? Finally, your value isn't determined by whether others recognize it. Sarah didn't become valuable when she revealed her identity. She was always valuable. The trio's recognition didn't change her. It only changed their perception. You don't need anyone's permission to be worthy. You don't need to prove yourself to people who've already decided to dismiss you. Their limitations are not your problem. Now, here's my question for you. What's the most surprising hidden story you've ever encountered? Have you ever made an assumption about someone only to discover you were completely wrong? Or have you been on the receiving end, judged, dismissed, or underestimated based on appearance? Share your story in the comments below. Let's learn from each other. Let's build a community that values substance over surface, that looks deeper than appearances, that recognizes the complexity and worth in every person we encounter. And if this story resonated with you, if it made you think differently about judgment, assumptions, and true value, subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. We're building a space for stories that challenge perspectives, reveal unexpected truths, and remind us that the world is far more complex and interesting than it appears on the surface, because the most important stories, they're often carried by the quietest people, wearing the simplest clothes, sitting in corners, unbothered and unshakable. Don't judge the book. Read it.